Watching your only child treat you like an absolute stranger in a room full of people is a kind of pain that alters your DNA forever. The grand ballroom was a blur of expensive white silk and heavy floral arrangements, a lavish spectacle built on a foundation of lies. My son Julian had spent the entire evening darting his eyes away from me, treating my presence like an embarrassing stain on his perfect new life. When he finally walked over, his face was contorted with a rehearsed malice that felt entirely foreign. He did not whisper his cruelty, choosing instead to shout for me to get out, so that everyone could hear his rejection. The sudden silence in the hall was deafening as hundreds of eyes turned toward me with a mixture of pity and shock. I refused to give him the satisfaction of a public breakdown, pulling myself upward with the quiet dignity I had spent a lifetime cultivating. As I walked out into the chilly autumn night, each step felt heavier than the last, carrying the crushing weight of decades spent sacrificing for him. Sitting alone in the quiet confinement of my sedan, memories of his childhood flooded my mind. I realized then that by constantly holding his hand and shielding him from every hardship, I had accidentally crippled his ability to feel gratitude. Back in my quiet living room, the empty space felt like a physical weight pressing against my chest as I poured a glass of water with trembling hands. I stared at the walls that had witnessed the darkest chapters of our lives, from the sudden night my husband passed away to the years I pulled double shifts just to keep Julian clothed. I had skipped meals and skipped birthdays, always smiling through my exhaustion so he would never feel the sting of poverty. Somewhere along that arduous journey, the gentle boy I raised had vanished, replaced by an entitled stranger who viewed my endless devotion as a baseline requirement. The next morning, the shrill ring of my telephone shattered the early silence while I was brewing my morning tea. Julian did not offer a single word of apology for the humiliation of the previous night, nor did he ask if I had made it home safely. Instead, his voice was cold and transactional as he demanded that I hand over the deeds to the family properties immediately. A strange, icy calm washed over me as I listened to his frantic demands, realizing that my compliance had finally reached its absolute limit. I quietly hung up the phone and walked over to the wooden cabinet, touching the thick envelope before locking it away. When Julian arrived at my doorstep an hour later, his frantic energy seemed to vibrate through the entire room. He began pacing back and forth, offering a string of hollow excuses about wedding stress, his new bride, and the overwhelming chaos of the event. I remained perfectly still, letting his frantic words hang in the air until he finally ran out of breath. I spoke softly about the public degradation he had inflicted on me, explaining that respect was the true currency of our relationship. He let out a bitter, mocking laugh before slamming the front door, leaving me to face the quiet agony of doing what was right. As the weeks bled into months, the constant anxiety that had governed my life began to dissolve into a profound sense of peace. I stopped staring at my silent phone and began reclaiming the fragments of myself that I had abandoned during my years of frantic motherhood. I reconnected with childhood friends, spent long afternoons lost in literature, and began taking slow morning walks through the neighborhood park. Rumors occasionally reached me through extended family that Julian was drowning in marital strife, but I resisted the urge to intervene, knowing that life was finally delivering the lessons I had failed to teach him. One evening, a sudden knock at the door revealed my son standing on the porch, looking older and visibly deflated. The arrogant posture he usually maintained had completely vanished, replaced by slumped shoulders and deep shadows beneath his hollow eyes. He sat on my sofa and began describing a chaotic home life filled with constant screaming matches, financial manipulation, and a deep, gnawing emptiness. I listened to his confessions without offering a single judgment or interruption, waiting for the inevitable moment he would ask. When he quietly brought up the property deeds again, my answer remained entirely unchanged, leaving him to walk away into the darkness. The silence that followed that night was immense, acting as a sturdy barrier that neither of us attempted to cross for a very long time. I used that profound isolation to completely reinvent my surroundings, purging old clutter and donating things that no longer served a purpose. I repainted Julian's old bedroom in soft, vibrant tones of sage green, a deliberate choice that belonged entirely to me rather than a child who had become a stranger. Every stroke of the paintbrush felt like reclaiming a piece of stolen territory, proving to myself that boundless giving had almost destroyed my own identity. Meanwhile, far away from my peaceful sanctuary, the structural integrity of Julian's artificial world was completely fracturing under the weight of his own decisions. The woman he had married valued financial dominance far more than mutual respect, and she was now using his own tactics against him. Every screaming match in his apartment became a distorted echo of the words I had spoken to him, forcing him to confront his own cruelty. Sitting alone in his empty kitchen after another devastating argument, the memory of my dignified exit from his wedding began to haunt his thoughts like an unresolvable debt. When he finally returned to my home on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, he stood outside under the awning for several minutes before summoning the courage to knock. The man who walked through my doorway carried a deep hesitation in his eyes, a vulnerability I had not seen since he was a frightened schoolboy. He tried to navigate the conversation with trivial observations about the weather and the house, but the heavy reality of his suffering could not be hidden. When he finally broke down and admitted that his life was completely unraveling, I invited him to sit at the table as an equal partner. Our interactions underwent a profound transformation over the following months, moving away from demands and shifting toward genuine curiosity. He began asking how I had survived the crushing loneliness after his father died, wondering how I managed to keep moving forward without turning bitter. I answered him with raw honesty, stripping away any romantic notions of motherhood to reveal the terrifying exhaustion I had hidden from him for decades. Watching his arrogant facade crumble piece by piece was difficult, but I knew he was finally learning that real strength is found in endurance rather than dominance. When the inevitable subject of the family inheritance finally surfaced during a quiet evening talk, his tone was entirely devoid of aggression. I looked into his eyes and explained that the property was never meant to be a trophy for good behavior or a weapon for punishment. It was a heavy responsibility that required maturity, a sacred trust that had to be earned through personal integrity rather than demanded by birthright. He slowly nodded his head in agreement, finally understanding that holding power without possessing core values is an entirely hollow existence that guarantees eventual ruin. By the time word reached me that his marriage had legally ended, Julian did not come running to my house looking for a financial savior or an easy escape. When he did arrive, he simply wanted to sit on the porch, drink tea, and reflect on the person he had allowed himself to become. He offered a sincere apology that carried no hidden agenda, and I accepted it with a cautious heart, knowing that rebuilding trust requires consistent action over a long period. We did not have a dramatic, tearful reconciliation, but rather the quiet beginning of a completely new relationship built on mutual respect. In the end, my victory was never about withholding material wealth or proving my son wrong in front of the world. I won the moment I chose my own self-worth over enabling his toxic behavior, ultimately teaching him the true meaning of human dignity. Julian did not truly lose an inheritance during that painful season of isolation. Instead, he successfully shed the heavy burden of entitlement. By allowing him to fall, I gave him the space to construct a genuine character, discovering that the most valuable things in this life can never be written on a piece of property paper.